Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And I'd like to take this opportunity to once again welcome everybody who is joining us tonight for this Zoom lecture, either on Zoom here in the call or joining us on the live stream on Facebook and YouTube. We're very, very glad that you are here for the symposium which our activities committee has organized. Unfortunately, it's already their last symposium of this academic year, but we're even happier that it's on such a important and I think also very current topic, namely the future of meat. And before I like to give the word to two members of the activities committee to introduce the two speakers that we have today. A short technical disclaimer: we will be having the lecture by our first speaker first. Then, if you have a couple of questions that are directly related to that lecture, you're welcome to ask them. But we will also have a more extensive Q&A session after both speakers have contributed their part. If you'd like to ask a question and you are in the Zoom call, please do that via the raise your hand function. And if you are watching on the live stream and you have a question, please feel free to just write your question in the comment, and then we will try to address that here as well. And thus, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Marianne, who will introduce our first speaker.
Okay, so hi everyone. As Nina has already said, on behalf of the activity committee, I would like to thank you so much for being here tonight. We are so glad to see that people are still interested in our events. So today we're going to have a symposium, and the topic is the future of the meat industry. So, for example, what does the future of the meat industry looks like, and are there any alternative to it, and so on. So today we're trying to answer all of these questions, and we will have the pleasure to hear two important speakers, Miss Birthe Steenberg and Professor Mark Post. So now I would like to introduce you the first speaker of tonight. So Miss Birthe Steenberg, she is the Secretary General of AVEC, which is an association that represents the voice of European poultry meat sector. At the same time, Mrs. Steenberg is an executive committee member of the International Poultry Council. She has significant experience in public affairs, food safety, microbiology, quality insurance, and so on. Furthermore, AVEC is a part of the European Livestock Voice, which is a multi-stakeholder group of European partners in the livestock food chain that decided to unite to bring back a balanced debate around this sector. Therefore, today's Mrs. Steenberg will speak also on behalf of the European Livestock Voice. So now I give the floor to Ms. Steenberg.
Thanks a lot, and thank you so much for the opportunity to talk with you all here today. I'm really pleased that we can do that. And now I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully everything will work here. Is it working? Not really. Can you see my screen?
We see your email.
We see my email. That's fantastic. That's not what I shared with you. So good that I didn't have any problems with that. Just one moment. I will talk while doing this. As you kindly introduced me, my name is Birthe Steenberg, and I am working normally from Brussels. Today, I am addressing you from Denmark because I actually am Danish. So at the 18th of March, when all this COVID crisis started, I escaped to Denmark, to my house, my husband and my dog. So if you hear a snoring in the background, it's not me, it's the dog who is helping me today. Now I think we have the right slide. Is that true?
Yes.
Yes. And if I were one of you, then I would maybe think, why should I listen to a lady in her 50s who's a lobbyist in Brussels. And some of you are thinking, I can see it in some of your faces, okay, boomer, right? But I think that you should listen to me just for this short while, because I really think I have a very important story to tell. But very important for us, and if I can get this to work, maybe I can, yes. We won't tell you what to eat, to drink, or to wear, but what we would like to tell you is our side of the story, because I'm sure that you are aware that much of the story about food production and agriculture nowadays are told by other people than the people working in this sector. And to be honest, the agricultural sector have done a really, really lousy job when it comes to communication. I was born in 1965. That's quite a long time ago, I know, but back then when I was a kid, everybody had a connection to agriculture. Everybody had a grandfather or an aunt or an uncle or a good friend who had a father who was a farmer, right? While I grew up, the number of farms in Europe declined tremendously, which meant that fewer and fewer people had a knowledge about what's going on at the farms. And at the same time, the farms were, of course, industrialized to be able to produce more, a bigger amount of livestock, a bigger amount of crops, but they didn't really tell about it. They kept, under the radar, so to speak. They didn't really tell the story about how this industrialization was done, and that it was done with a focus on many good things like animal welfare, like environmental protection, and like food safety. So now we really have a lack of communication. We need to fill out this gap, and that's why, excuse me, that we in Brussels went together, 11 different associations, all with a connection to livestock production, tried to join and spread the word on how we from the sector side see the production, to try to spread the facts. It is very important for us to say that we won't tell you what to do, but we would like to present you with the facts so you can go home, or you are home now, so you can reflect on it and afterwards form your opinions on a more informed basis. So that was sort of the introduction to everything, I think. Okay. We actually owe a lot to animal protein. And why is that? Yes, because when our ancestors many, many years ago lived in Europe and Africa and other places, they used quite a lot of their energy on their digestion. When they started to eat animal protein, and actually there are archaeological findings that shows that 2.5 million years ago, there were slaughtering of animals already. And giving that high quality diet that animal protein actually is, helped the guts not to take so much energy. And then it was possible for the brain to improve and to get larger. So we owe a lot to animal protein. We are not thinking about that in our everyday life, I guess. Sorry. This slide, I have to thank Professor Dr. Frédéric Leroy from the Vrije Universiteit in Brussels a lot for sharing with me. It's his doing. It's something that is, when I saw his presentation the first time and then afterwards asked him if I could use this slide, I was actually quite surprised by it. And I think you're going to be as well. Because even today, hunters and gatherers, they are eating quite a lot of meat, from 80 to 500 kilo per capita per year. And that's really a lot. And actually, when you read scientific articles, you don't see that these people have any health issues that's different from the people in the Western world. In the West today, we are eating, there it says, around 50 kilos of red meat plus 24 to 50 kilos of poultry meat. Actually, when you look at the numbers from the OECD and FAO, it's in US, they eat 96 kilos of meat per capita. That's both poultry and red meat. In Europe, we eat 65 kilos, where 24 of them are poultry meat. And then there is what Professor Leroy calls the virtual reality. It's the reality that many voices are talking about today that we should go over to eat far, far less meat. And why is that? Why is it that everybody thinks that we should eat less meat? Some say it's because of health issues, some say it's because of the environment, and some says it's because of animal welfare. And I will try to touch upon these three topics in my presentation here. And I'm very, very curious and excited to hear your questions afterwards and to learn from your thoughts about meat and how the future of meat is going to be. So I'm looking very much forward to the discussion we're going to have afterwards. You see, meat is really a great source of protein. And that's why most doctors dealing with children and elderly people emphasize that it's important to have meat in your diet because you need the protein. There's also some vitamins and some minerals you don't get if you are not eating meat. If you're a vegetarian, you have to be sure that you are taking these vitamins and these minerals beside your everyday meals, so you're sure that you have all the different substances that you need to function. And when it comes to nutrition, and that we also in the Western world have a huge problem with obesity, and there it's good you can't see the rest of me because I'm actually one of them who have that problem. But then if we want to tackle that problem, maybe it's a good idea to eat meat if you need protein. Because here in this slide, you see on every plate, there is 28 grams of protein. So you can get 28 grams of protein by eating one chicken breast fillet, that will give you 140 kilocalories, or you can choose to eat 188 grams of hazelnut. That will give you 1,120 kilocalories. And this is not something that you think about every day, but I think it's a quite important information to have. And again, meat is a very important substance in the diet for children, but also for the elderly who needs easy digestible protein to maintain their functions. Now we go a little bit over to the environmental side. Because when you, like I do, work in Brussels, then you, and there's a lot going on in Brussels, as I'm sure you're aware, about making a new Green Deal and making a sustainable farm to fork policy. And we are all behind that. That's a really, really good idea. What we need to do when we make such policies is to look at the holistic view. And that's where we sometimes run into trouble. Because not everybody thinks about that. If you want to grow vegetables and crops, you actually need livestock, because the manure produced by livestock is fertilizing the soil, so you can grow the vegetables and the crops. Another very important thing is that only 30% of the crops are actually digestible for humans. So people who are saying that we should just all be vegetarians, then there would be food for all. It's actually not really true, because only 30% of what we grow is digestible for us. We can't, like the cows, go out on a grass field and get all our feed there. So we need livestock to take care of this conversion of the plant protein to get a balanced diet to humans. So circular agriculture is very, very important. And it's based on, as you can see, the principle of optimizing the use of biomass, where the waste streams of one supply chain can be raw materials for the next. So, and there we are in Europe very, very good at using this system. Meat has been the scapegoat, so to speak, when it comes to emissions. When we talk about emissions to the atmosphere and GHG emissions and so forth, then the picture we get in our heads are beef, mainly. That's at least my opinion, and I would like to hear yours afterwards. We hear that meat is the big scapegoat here. Meat is really, really bad. But when you look at this figure, and this is not a figure I made, it's from FAO, agriculture and livestock is responsible for 10% of the allocation of the GHG emissions. It's not much. The energy sector is really the place where we are having trouble. Just an example. Some people have made this example that if you take a return flight from Brussels to Rome, one flight to Rome, one back again, then the emission that gives for one passenger is more than the same person's meat intake for a whole year if they eat the average amount of meat. I'm not saying that if you don't fly, then you can just eat all the meat you want. I'm not saying that you can just fly and then don't eat any meat. I'm just saying be aware of all these facts when you make your policies. That is really, really important. Since the last 30 years, we have really done a huge job in Europe to try to get down the emissions from agriculture. And that's been done by lots of innovations. We are using precision farming. We are using digitalization, all the things that are also a part of the new Green Deal. So we try to optimize even more. And that's, of course, something we need to work on with. We are not finished, not at all. But it's not because we are producing less that this has gone down. It's because we're in a smarter way. And I can show you that on this slide, because this is, again, data from FAO, where you can see how much emission there is of per million tons animal protein. And there, as you see, in Europe, we're doing quite a good job. You might ask, why is Russia below Europe? And the explanation for that is mainly that they are not producing that much beef in Russia, because when it comes to meat production, beef is the most heavy on climate damage, so to speak. But in Europe, we're doing a great job. So let's say that we find out we are not going to produce that much meat in Europe anymore because we think meat is bad for humans, meat is bad for the climate. The problem is the consumers does not feel that. There's just been released a new report which has been made from the consumers organizations in Brussels called Birthe. And there it was quite evident that the consumers do not feel that their meat intake is a problem for the climate. So it's not likely that the European consumers will eat less meat. So if we produce less meat in Europe and the consumers will eat the same amount, then we will have to import meat from third countries where there is a higher impact on the climate of producing meat, which of course, because emissions does not know any borders. So then globally, we would have a huge problem when it comes to emissions. That's not a good idea. But then, of course, we are going, and I'm looking very, very much forward to hearing the presentation of Professor Post. Then maybe lab meat is a possibility. I don't know that much about lab meat, if any. So I'm really looking forward to get much wiser on that in the presentation which is going to come after this one. Animal welfare. Many people do not eat meat because they think that the animals are not living under decent circumstances. And there I can tell you that in Europe, we have legislation on animal welfare. That's not the case in many other parts of the world. We have had legislation for quite a while, and that legislation is based on scientific evidence made from EFSA in Parma. And I'm not saying that it's fine and we couldn't do more. Of course, we should always try to improve, but we have animal welfare legislation. And that actually is very visible on this chart. This is the Animal Protection Index, and it's been updated this year in 2020. And you can see the organization behind it at the right part of the screen. So it's animal welfare associations together with the OIE. And there you can see that Europe is actually doing quite fine when it comes to animal welfare. Again, I'm not saying that we are all good and that we just can keep on. We have jobs to do, that's for sure, but we are on the right path. Again, then, if we are not producing meat or livestock in Europe and we import it from third countries, you can do your own maths. Would that be better for the animal welfare? Maybe not. What would the world look like without livestock? We are going to hear a lot about lab meat later. That's going to be very, very interesting. But as far as I know, until now, it still demands quite a lot of different ingredients to grow lab meat. So it's still not, as far as I know, very sustainable. Maybe it's on its way. Let's see. When it comes to renewable energy and fertilizers and lots of other things, what should we do without livestock? Then we would have to use chemical fertilizers. And in the new Green Deal, the Commission has just launched the idea that we should decrease the use of chemical fertilizers with 20%. So we have to look at it in a holistic way. Behind every livestock farm, there's actually 7 jobs in rural areas. Now, I guess you all live in a big city like Groningen, but many of you maybe are originating from a village where your parents are still living and who would like to stay on living there. And there's less and less job in rural areas. And if we are declining the farming and the agricultural production, then we will lose jobs in rural areas. Just in the poultry sector, which I represent, we are having 370,000 jobs directly. Poultry is produced on 25,000 family farms around in Europe, and that's just poultry. Then we have beef, then we have milk, then we have pork, then we have crops, agriculture as a whole. So lots of things would happen if we are going down in the livestock production. And then in our everyday lives, many other products have a link with agriculture. I mean, please have a look down at your shoes, everybody. Are they made of leather? Because then livestock has been involved. Your medicines, if any of you have to take any medicines, probably there's some part that livestock has produced. What about wine? We all like a glass of wine, at least I know I do. And wine is also a part of the whole circle when it comes to circular agriculture. So there would be a lot of consequences if we are not producing livestock in Europe. So the most important thing for us right now, and there I'm talking about my generation, because it's my generation now who are the decision makers. We're going to make the policies which will have a huge impact on your lives. So we need to do a good job. It's really important. We have to find a balance between having a sustainable production and to be able to produce food for maybe up to 10 billion people on the planet in 2050. And that's a delicate balance. And we simply need to use science to find out what to do. There's much of the debate right now which is based on emotions and not on science. And this is a little bit dangerous for the future, because if we base our arguments on emotions, then we might not get the best result in the end. Sustainable production, less water use, less energy use, less land use, less materials, less building space. I'm sure that you can all agree that that's the way we want to go. Then it can puzzle me a little bit that the Commission now have gone out and said that 25% of the agricultural land in Europe should be organic in 2030. Because at least the thing I know mostly about poultry production, if you want to produce an organic chicken, it takes much more water, it takes much more feed, and when it takes more feed, there's more land use and so forth. I'm not saying organic is bad, not at all. I would also buy an organic chicken now and then, but we just need to know the science behind so we make the right policies. Very important. And now, hopefully, a film will start. Hopefully. It started now on my computer. Hopefully, it will start on yours.
Today, it's easier to say what we don't want and what we don't like. It's easy to put forward an opinion and to hit the headlines with striking images. The problem is, we tend to forget all about the knock-on effects of those opinions. Today, the livestock sector is taking centre stage in Europe, with some even calling for a drastic reduction. However, a livestock exit would have severe consequences. An EU without livestock would not only lose a precious source of locally produced safe food, but also essential habitats and biodiversity. Such an EU would also face increased forest fires, serious lack of natural fertilisers, green energy and essential raw materials, while witnessing an increased rural exodus. We're convinced that European livestock farming model based on diversified local and family farm structures is the backbone of our rural areas. European livestock farms are and continue to adapt to contribute to the bioeconomy, to storing carbon while ensuring an affordable supply of nutritious food, as well as many other products needed for a healthy lifestyle. We won't tell you what to eat, drink or wear, but it's good to hear the two sides of the story before forming an opinion, because when you make a choice, you also choose all of its consequences. Meet the facts first.
I think it's a good idea to show you the world meat consumption forecast from OECD FAO. They make such an agricultural outlook every year. And this one is the newest one. It's from 2019. And as you can see, all the meat types are going up. And I'm proud to say that poultry is going by fastest. My pork colleagues does not really like this graph. I love it. No, that was not funny. Sorry. It goes up. And why does it go up? Because you all think that the meat consumption here in Europe is declining. It is declining for pork and beef, but it's not declining for poultry. It's still going a little bit up for poultry in Europe. But where the growth really is in the developing world. Because in Asia, Southeast Asia, in Africa, some countries, at least until the COVID crisis, they saw a growing economy, which meant that many families got more money in their hands, so they actually were able to buy meat to serve their children a very good meal. And the first meat species they can buy is poultry because it's the most affordable. And many, many people in the world are still suffering from food insecurity. Food insecurity has not been something we have been discussing in Europe in my lifetime, but here during the COVID crisis, we have actually started to talk about it because we've suddenly had the feeling that it is quite vulnerable, right? We could, if a major crisis occurs and all the farmers got ill, for instance, what would happen? Then we wouldn't have any food to put on our plates every day. So it is very important when we make policies that we take this into account. We need to produce food for people the very first thing that happens if there's not food enough is that people start to want to make revolutions, and then the world can fall apart. That was a comment of my own, not of my company here. But it is very, very important. So to close off, is there a future for meat? And I guess it's not a surprise for you that I would say, yes, indeed there is. And I would encourage you very, very much to go into our common website, which of the European Livestock Voice. It's called meetthefacts.eu. Have I written com? Then it's wrong. It's meetthefacts.eu. That's really embarrassing. Meetthefacts.eu, where there is so much good information and facts behind what's going on in agriculture. So I encourage you to use this website, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all your questions. And thanks so much for giving us this possibility to speak to you today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for these insights you offered. Yeah, we can give you a round of virtual applause.
Thank you.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. And as I said at the beginning, we now have some space for questions that are directly addressed to Ms. Steenberg. But we will also have a more extensive Q&A where you can also ask questions to her at the end. So if you have any questions right now, if you're watching on the live stream, please write them in the comments. But if you're here in the Zoom call, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. I see a question from, I apologize in advance if I mispronounced your name, Brandy or Brandy? Yes.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering if you think that there's a lot of evidence of hunter-gatherers eating meat just because it's more obvious evidence compared to them eating crops and plants and vegetables?
Well, yes, there is quite some evidence. I mean, if you take the hunters and gatherers, for instance, in a very tiny part of the Danish kingdom called Greenland, there they don't have any crops, or didn't have at least until very recently. So there they really had a diet which consisted mainly of meat. So that's quite a good evidence we have there. So yes, I think so. And when it comes to health, thank you for the question, by the way. It was a very good question. And when it comes to health issues with meat, in our society, in the Western society, it's always very difficult to rule out what is the effect of meat, what is the effect of the wine you have with meat, what is the effect of the sauce you have with the meat, what is the effect of people who are heavy meat eaters, maybe also work in offices and are not, exercising enough. It's really, really difficult to make some very good studies with epidemiology on that. And the scientists are sometimes arguing quite a lot on what is right and what is wrong here. But for the hunters gatherers, it's easier because they simply don't have the possibility. So I hope it answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Then the next question comes from Alan.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask something really quick.
Yeah.
You said that stopping the production of meat would endanger the jobs of many people, but aren't those jobs already disappearing because of automation? And why is it because agriculture in general has developed a lot of automation in those type of jobs. So would you think that will disappear as a cause?
Again, a really good question. Actually, I would say that here in Europe, the automation have taken place. Here during the COVID crisis, for instance, we have heard a lot about problems at slaughterhouses. That has been more in the US because here in Europe, the slaughterhouses are very automated because, and I'm sorry to say, but it's much more expensive to pay salary to people than to maintain a machine. And that's why the European slaughterhouses have done that. In the US, they have a different workforce. Maybe they are not paying the same amount of salaries. That's a political discussion I shouldn't go into. So I think in Europe, the automation have already been done. Of course, there can be done more, but I think there's quite a long time until it will never. I mean, as a farmer, you have to have the knowledge, the feeling, especially when you have livestock. Machines, computers can help you. Temperature surveillance, humidity surveillance, many things can help you. But if you don't have the feeling and the passion for the animals, then you're not having a good production. Then you're not earning money. That's simply how it is. And I don't see that disappearing in at least in my lifetime. But it's a very good question, definitely. But I think much of the automation have already taken place here in Europe, at least.
All right, thank you very much. We have one more question from Brandy, I see, and after that, I'd suggest we move on to Mark Post.
I'm wondering if you do any research or studies about transitioning to insect protein?
Very, very interesting questions. We are having an association in Brussels taking care of that. It's called IFPIF, yes, it's a really funny name. And we are, of course, watching that very thoroughly because both for insects for feeding of chickens, but of course also insects for feeding of humans. And that's something that's developing, and it's developing quite fast. But again, still, the things you need to feed the insects are still so very expensive. So it's not sustainable yet, but I'm sure it will come. I have been served a grasshopper once. I ate it. I would not say I enjoyed it, but maybe I will in the future. I don't know. But of course, it's something that we should look deeper into, definitely.
All right, thank you very much for these interesting questions. Yeah, I think then now we will give the stage to our second speaker, and first of all to Ellie to give a little introduction.
Thank you, Nina. So we'll now hear about the current issues with the meat production and the state of technology and the future outlook from Dr. Mark Post. He's the chair of physiology and vice dean of biomedical technology at the Maastricht University. And in 2013, he was the first in the world to prove the concept of cultured meat. So that is lab-grown meat. And so now I would like you all to please welcome Dr. Mark Post.
Well, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity to present to you here through this virtual kind of system. Also, my screen just, okay. Do you see my full screen or just my presentation screen?
Just the presentation.
Okay, good. So just as a disclaimer, yes, I am a professor at Maastricht University, so I'm publicly funded, but I'm also a co-founder and chief scientific officer of two startup companies. One is Mosameat that aims to commercialize cultured meat, and the other is Corium, a similar company, similar technology, but now for leather applications. So for another kind of byproduct of the meat industry, if you like. So we are going to, feeding the world is a very complex problem. And it was already mentioned that you have to look at it holistically. That's true. So feeding the world is complex, and it's going to become more complex, not only because we go from 7 to 10 billion people, but also because those people will have more sophisticated needs for different types of foods. And I love meat. I'm a meat eater. I wanted to do a poll among you. I'm pretty sure that quite a few of you are actually vegetarian, because that's typically the case among students, young students. And why do I think that's a problem? I think that's a problem because meat is a very resource intense part of our diet, especially beef, as was already kind of alluded to. So to give you an idea, and it's a rough estimate, and you see other numbers too, mostly higher, for a quarter pounder of hamburger, which is basically a normal hamburger, it requires about 7 pounds of grain fed to the animal, 210 liters of water, 70 square meters of land, and enough energy to power your microwave for about 10 minutes. It's actually so resource intense that, and this is data from the FAO, that about 70% of all our agricultural production is used to feed livestock. Livestock, and not only cows. This picture depicts cows, but it's also cows, pigs, sheep, chicken, and so forth. So that's 70% of all the agricultural land, and the same FAO predicts that in 2050, and you saw already those curves of meat consumption going up and meat production going up, that in 2050, the consumption of meat, or the demand for meat, will be 70% higher than it is right now. So you can do that math. That's not going to work. We have to figure out how to do that. In addition, and I kind of like this slide, this is specific for cows. They are significant greenhouse gas emitters. You saw those numbers divided over the different sectors. And livestock, agriculture, and land use together is about 20% of all our greenhouse gas emissions. So it is an appreciable part of our greenhouse gas emission. And if we can somehow mitigate that consequence of livestock agriculture, I think should. Why is it? Why is it such a resource intense part of our diet? It was already mentioned, you can kind of look at, somewhat disrespectful, look at animals as a technology that converts vegetable proteins in their diet to animal proteins in our diet. And it's called the conversion ratio, and it's here, as mentioned, for beef, it's actually very bad. Only 15% gets kind of converted into animal proteins, and you see that for pork, that's in green here, it's a lot better. For chicken, it's even better, and for fish, it's pretty much the same as plants. So you have to make the distinction. I completely agree with Ms. Steenberg that you have to make a distinction between those species. There's no question, at least in terms of impact on the environment. Now, we can all become vegetarian. And I assume that some of you are vegetarian. I assume that those are healthy and do sports and are lead happy lives. Moreover, in the world, there are 2 billion people vegetarian. Mostly involuntarily. It was already alluded to, most people, or those 2 billion people in the world, typically cannot afford to eat meat. And so they are kind of involuntarily vegetarian. They once in a while drink some milk or eat an egg, and you can get a long way with that, but they are vegetarian. And guess what? They live and they procreate and they have reasonably normal lives. The story, the archaeological story, and I really like the example of Greenland, where extreme carnivorism actually supports the people there, to India, where for religious reasons, a lot of people are vegetarian or because they cannot afford meat. So it basically shows how adaptive our digestive system is and how we can live on very, very different diets without any problem. Now, if you are completely vegan, no animal proteins whatsoever, I do agree you have to be careful. You have to actually know what you're doing. I've met a lot of vegans and vegetarians during the last 5 or 10 years, and most of them are completely healthy, but most of them know what they are doing, especially the vegans. Now, this is a little bit of a strange graph. This is the human trophic level. This is where we are in the food chain. It's 1 for a plant. It's 2 for an animal that eats plants. It's 3 for an animal that eats animals that eats plants, okay? So it's kind of weird. We are at 2.35. Let's say, oops, I cannot use my, pointer. You see here in the top left, you see that kind of pink, vague pink line. That's 2.35, that's where we are. 35% of our calories come from animals that eat plants. And you see the bottom line, which is kind of, I don't know what color that is, but it's China and India. And over the last 30 years, they have gradually kind of creeped up to that same number. And why is that? That's because that human trophic level, you see that on the right part of the screen, the human trophic level here is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the gross domestic product of a country. You see, as soon as countries become richer, they start to eat more meat. They kind of go up in that human trophic level. So that's where that 70% of increase in meat consumption is going to come from, not only from going from 7 to 10 million people, but also for increasing consumption of meat in countries that currently cannot afford it. So globally, we are going towards a trend where meat is really still part of our future, at least the next 30 years or so. So what else can you do? Well, you can start to create meat in a different way. Animals use their stem cells in their muscle to create muscle. And we do, as people, we do exactly the same way. And all our muscles have stem cells. And if we are adults, we still have quite a few of those stem cells in reserve in case of injury. So what you can do, you can pick these stem cells out of the muscle and let them do what they do best. 1, proliferate to many, many high numbers of cells, and 2, make muscle tissue. Now, if you think about what you eventually want to do, you can, this is maybe you know this from high school. This is what a muscle looks like. It's on the left upper side. It's a muscle. Then if you zoom in, you get a muscle bundle, and then you get a muscle fiber, and then you get a muscle cell. And a muscle cell actually is pretty particular. It's a merger. It's a very large cell, a merger of a large number of cells. And then if you zoom further in, that muscle is chock full of proteins, specifically the proteins that make up the contractile machinery, make muscles contract. So along that stream, you can do a couple of things. You can just make the proteins. You can use yeast or bacteria or whatever system to make the proteins. You can, is my thing stuck? I think it's stuck. No, it's not. Then you can just culture the cells and add that to an otherwise plant-based product. Or you can make those muscle fibers with the contractile proteins, with the full muscle structure, if you like, except that you don't have the muscle bundles. And you eventually can make the entire tissue, let's say a filet mignon or a ribeye steak. And some companies are already kind of moving into a full thickness tissue. So this is the muscle cell that I talked about, a very large cell, multinucleated. And in the 60s, somebody said, well, wait a minute, some of those nuclei are not actually part of the muscle cell. They're called kind of satellite cells. And these were in 2000 by Michael Rudnicki designated as the bona fide stem cells of our muscle. So they repair muscle when it's injured. So what we do is we take a biopsy from a cow, get those, this is just 0.5 gram of tissue, get those stem cells out, let them proliferate many, many, many times, And if you do that, that's an exponential process. That's why on the y-axis here, it's an exponential curve, and on the x-axis, it's the number of doublings. So every time a cell doubles, you get a doubling of the number of cells, of course. And if you do the math, if you get 32 doublings out of that, which we currently do kind of routinely, out of that half a gram of tissue, you produce 2,000 kilos of meat. So that would reduce the number of cows that you would have in the world tremendously, and therefore diminish greenhouse gas emissions. So that's kind of our goal. Now, those cells that have multiplied are not really muscle yet, so they don't have any protein content, they don't have any taste or structure. So what you need to do is to drive them to make muscle tissue. And the first step is that you let them merge into a muscle fiber. And that's very simple. You basically tell them stop growing by changing the feed a little bit. And then they start to form muscle, merged muscle cells. And then you have to make tissue out of it. And that's a little bit more complex. Here you have you have these merged muscle cells, and we put them in a gel that you cannot see here, in a ring structure. And we do specifically a ring structure because they start to organize, self-organize into a muscle fiber. They do that kind of automatically into a muscle fiber, and then they start to contract. And when they contract, they develop tension because, I apologize for that, because they're in a ring structure. And as you can learn from, just looking at people who run marathons, they typically don't have thick muscles. So a movement itself doesn't lead to thick muscles. You have to go to the gym and lift weights to get thick muscles. So the tension is a bigger driver for protein synthesis than movement itself. So in 2013, we made 10,000 of these muscle fibers. We basically molded them into a patty, into a hamburger, and we presented that as kind of the first hamburger made of stem cell, muscle stem cells. Now that hamburger costed us €250,000 to make. So it was not a cheap endeavor, and there were all sorts of other issues. So that's fine. We wanted to show that this technology is there, and that we need to think about meat consumption and meat production in the future. So how do you go from there to something that could actually be a solution to the problem? So first of all, you have to make it efficient, which is very important to me. You have to make sure that all the resources that you need are very efficiently used. So you can play with the cell culture conditions, you can select the cells in a smarter way, and of course you can scale up. Now this is actually just to show you a pretty picture. Here you see the beginning of muscle fibers of these cells. I cannot go into all those details about the culture conditions and the scaling, but here is one of the things that we published. When you scale, you don't grow them on a petri dish. You actually grow them in a tank, very similar to how you brew beer in a tank. So it's actually very similar tanks. So you can grow cells in a tank, and you can make those tanks pretty much as big as you want. So that goes towards scaling. And efficiency is important, and scale is important for efficiency. You also want it to be sustainable, and I mean that in a very strict way, meaning that every component that you use in the production process is of seemingly unlimited supply, either because it is unlimited or because you can recycle it. So one of the components in cell culture traditionally is serum, which is a blood-derived product. Guess what? Coming from cows. So we wanted to get rid of that, of course. And the gel in which the cells are sitting temporarily was also still animal-derived. So we've spent a lot of time and a lot of effort in getting rid of that serum. And here you see proliferation curves of cells in the absence and presence of serum. And actually now we have a system where we can completely grow these cells without serum, and also, by the way, without antibiotics. The gel, I will have to go over this. The gel we have replaced by an alginate gel, so from algae, which is already food grade and very cheap and very, very widely available. So we make now these muscle fibers. This already much more looks like a muscle fiber than those green things. And you know, this technology is basically kind of mature now. The other thing that you can do is recycle, as I mentioned, and I like that a lot. This is a contained system. It's a tank, and you grow the muscle or the cells in that tank, and you can reuse most of the materials that you use in that system. So this is a very busy slide. These are on the left-hand side, the essential amino acids. On the right-hand side, the non-essential amino acids. So we have 22 amino acids that together build our proteins. 8 of them or 9 of them we cannot make ourselves. We have to get that out of the diet. And that's where kind of the term high quality proteins come from. And the other 14 amino acids we can just make ourselves. So we don't really need to have them in the diet. Now, if you look at in the feed of these cells, and you look after 7 days, which is already a long time for cell culture, you see that still after 7 days, 30 to 70% of all those amino acids are still there. And then typically we throw it away because the cells also produce waste. This is, by the way, the link to fertilizer in the end, because the waste is basically ammonium, just like it is in animals. So we realized that we are throwing away valuable resources after 7 days. So we are recycling the medium, taking out the ammonium you can use for something else, for fertilizer, and reuse the medium to grow the cells in. Then finally, of course, you want to grow something that is very similar, if not completely identical to meat, because that's the product that people love. Again, they don't need it, but it's the product that people love. So you have to make sure that the color is right. There's that nice red color, that the texture, the mouthfeel of meat is right, and that the taste is right. And again, I cannot go into all those details, but the color actually comes from a protein called myoglobin. In chicken, there is about only 10% of the myoglobin, and as there is in beef. That's why chicken is relatively pale and beef is very, very red. And we needed to boost the myoglobin expression by these cells. And basically, if you grow the cells under lower oxygen conditions, they start to make more myoglobin and they become nicely red and have the heme iron that we find is an important nutritional value. In 2013, we didn't make fat tissue yet. And currently we do. This is how you basically make fat tissue also out of stem cells. This is a different stem cell coming from the same biopsy, and you can make them into full fat tissue. Fat is also a tissue. And we have developed a system that's completely food compatible and that very robustly turns these cells into fat cells. Here, all the small green globules are fat cells, very similar to what we have in a steak when we eat it. Now, our fat tissue is slightly different in that it's much more rich in omega-3 fatty acids. So it's actually not as detrimental to your health as regular beef is. Now, interestingly, when we presented this in London in 2013, everybody said, yuck, I don't like lab meat. It doesn't sound good. And I can get that. That's, we are biologically programmed not to eat stuff that we don't know. On the other hand, in the Netherlands, we eat frikandellen. And nobody really knows what it is. Nobody wants to know what it is, and we still eat it. So we are also there pretty flexible in what we can eat, as long as we can trust that it is safe. Now, we recently did a study in the south of the Netherlands where we looked at this and a little bit more in depth and had people eat pieces of cultured meat and non-cultured meat. Actually, it was a psychological study. We kind of faked it, where we looked at what type of information do actually people need to start accepting this. So this was the setup, 190, 200 participants, and we divided them in 3 groups, and we gave them different information on what cultured meat is and what the benefits are or the qualities. And then we had them eat a piece of meat that was labeled conventional and a piece of meat that was labeled cultured, although they were both conventional. And let them comment on, again, acceptance, but also on the taste of the piece of meat. This is the outcome. It's, again, a very busy slide. We asked 4 questions. Are you in favor of the technology? Do you want to taste it? Do you want to buy it? Do you want to replace your current meat consumption with cultured meat consumption? This is before we gave the information, after we gave the information, and after we had them taste the so-called cultured piece of meat. And what was obvious is that, if the different colors were the different pieces of information that they got, there was no difference between the colors, right? So it didn't really matter what type of information we gave, but what did matter is giving information. So every time we gave information, the acceptance, whether it was for favor or for taste or buying or replacing, went up. So people would like to have information about this, and then they become more acceptant. What was also interesting is everybody ate that piece of meat that was labeled conventional, and when they commented on the taste, they found that, labeled cultured, and when they commented on the taste, they found the stuff that was labeled cultured tasting better than the conventional, although they were exactly the same. So people are kind of gullible in how they determine taste. All right, so what about the cost? 250,000 euro for a hamburger is not a particularly accessible item. So we are now at about 10, 14 euro for a hamburger. And getting from there to really cheap hamburgers, we actually need to change this technology, which is essentially a medical technology with medical ingredients, to feed grade ingredients that we also feed our animals. Now, you cannot directly feed a sugar beet or a fodder beet to a cell, so you have to make sugar or saccharides out of it, and the same is true for the proteins. When we started in 2008, we were the first in the world. Up till 3 years ago, we were the only ones. Now, every month, a company is added to this industry. People are working on fish, on pork, on chicken, on beef. This is now getting into a real small industry, if you like. It's still small. There are not really products on the market yet, so it's still in its infancy. By the way, some of the investors in this space are actually traditional meat producers. It's a novel food according to the EU regulation, so we have to go through the novel food regulation, which I think is a good idea, because that should instill trust on people that this is a completely safe product. We have to show that it is safe. So my idea for the future is actually a very conventional one, that we can still enjoy meat the way we do it right now, or chicken or fish or pork, but without the negative externalities on our environment and also, of course, on animal welfare. Finally, I would like to thank the group. We are now with 45 people working on this. Very, very motivated people, very talented people, and we have made great progress, but so have the other companies. So I'm pretty confident this is going to happen in the next couple of years. With that, I would like to thank you, and I'm happy to entertain questions.
Yes, also a virtual applause to you. Oh, actually, applause. Very nice. Yeah, thank you very much for this presentation about lab-grown meat. And as said, we now have space for questions, both in the live stream, if you're watching us on there. Feel free to write questions or opinions in the comments. And here in the Zoom call, please raise your hand if you have a question. We'll start again with Birthe.
If you do a life cycle assessment of how you're producing your cultured meat and compare it to the meat industry, at this moment, do you think the life cycle assessment would show that you're using more or less greenhouse gases?
There are now five life cycle analyses done, which are all anticipatory life cycle analyses. So that means that typically you do a life cycle analysis if the production process is completely kind of described, right? So if you do a life cycle analysis before that, it's called an anticipatory life cycle analysis. So you have to make a lot of assumptions on how things will eventually develop. And that also explains why the 5 life cycle analysis studies that have been done so far kind of differ in their outcome. So the first one was very enthusiastic. They said, oh, you save 95% of the land, 90% of the water, and 66% of the energy. Later life cycle analyses have kind of confirmed the land and water use, which is already a big deal. But they are differing on the energy consumption. And you can argue about these assumptions that people make, that's all fine. I tend not to look at these life cycle analyses that way. I tend to look at them, is where do we need to change things or improve things to make progress in, for instance, energy consumption. And the other thing I want to say, I'm also faculty member at Singularity University, so I'm exposed to a lot of people thinking about other technological problems as well. And my colleagues from the energy sector say, well, at some point, energy no longer equates with greenhouse gas emission because you can use renewable energy, and energy will become very, very cheap. So almost a non-problem, if you like. And then you still have the added benefits on less land use, water use, and of course, animal welfare.
Thank you very much for that answer. Are there further questions? It's also possible to, again, ask questions to Ms. Steenberg or maybe to both speakers. So feel free.
I'm sorry, I don't have the raise your hand function because I'm a co-host, but I have a question to Professor Post.
Yes.
Because you showed some really interesting survey that you made in the south of the Netherlands on how people are seeing lab meat. Just the day before yesterday, BOC, the European Consumer Organization, they released a report where it's quite obvious, and it's quite a big survey, that only 13% of the consumers are interested in lab meat. So I guess you have the same problem with communication as we have in the livestock sector. Or what's your take on that?
So there are now somewhere between 25 and 30 surveys throughout the world. Some in Europe, US, South America, Australia, India, and China. They started in 2011 with these surveys, which is kind of interesting, very early, and have continued up till now. And what you see over time is that the acceptance is increasing to roughly about 50% of the population saying, well, yeah, I can see this happening. We also see that it's very, very dependent on whether people already know about this or not. So prior awareness, and this comes out of many of those surveys, prior awareness actually increases acceptance quite a bit. So the reason I think why we saw 50% acceptance even before we gave any information here in this part of the country is that a lot of people were already aware of this technology, because here it's where it started. But you see that across the different nations, that prior awareness is a big driver of acceptance. Now, these are all surveys. It doesn't tell you exactly what people are going to do when they're in the supermarket. So that's why we had a tasting session here where people were really confronted with a piece of meat. Do you want to eat it right now? And I'm actually not concerned about this at all. The product is not on the market yet, so it's all kind of theoretical still. But even for a product that's not on the market and is still theoretical, this is already a high acceptance rate.
I would like to challenge you a little bit, because are you aware of these people who took your survey? How much do they actually know about livestock production? Because that's actually what we experience on and on again, because we have been from the agricultural sector so lousy in communication the last 30 years that people know very little about agriculture and how things are produced.
I don't think,
for instance,
sorry. Yeah.
Just very short. Here in Denmark, where I'm from, I worked for the Danish poultry sector before I got the job in Brussels. And in 2015, we had a survey made. 1,000 Danes were interviewed about poultry production. And 57% of the interviewed people, they thought that broilers, chickens raised for slaughter, that they grow in cages, which is not the case. And it's not because Danes are stupid. Well, some of us are, I know, but not all of us. It's because we haven't been good enough in telling the story. So I would say that if people knew more about how livestock is taken care of today in Europe, then they might not be as interested in lab meat as the southern Dutch people there in your survey. But that's a challenge, I know.
Yeah, but I don't think it really matters that much, to be honest, because in the end, if you have an alternative for, and I'm not vilifying the livestock industry. I absolutely don't, and I don't want to. I'm a meat eater. I have been relying on the livestock sector for most of my life, for part of my diet. So I'm not vilifying the life sector. I'm just doing observations where, and kind of a sort of analysis that makes sense to me. The reason why, so first of all, one observation that I made, if I give presentations to audiences like this in Zurich or Berlin or London, and these are all very, very selected populations. I do realize that. But 25% of the people are vegetarian. And 10% of those people are vegan. It's no longer a sect. It's no longer something that we look upon as these people are crazy, right? It's changing. The attitude is changing. So that's one observation, and it's a very skewed observation. It's not scientific. There's no data. It's just seeing kind of a trend start somewhere. The other observation that I have made over the last 30 years myself is that the ethics towards using animals for human purpose is shifting, right? It started with not using lab animals for cosmetics. It now goes into not using lab animals for medical purposes. This country, the Netherlands, wants to be lab animal free in 2025. It's not going to happen, but that's what the goal is. And you see that shifting over, I have seen that shifting over the last 30 years towards less more or less being less comfortable with using animals for human purpose. The food system will be the last one because it affects us immediately. Now, if we have credible alternatives for those meats, those ethics will start to shift much faster, is my...
It's a very interesting, and it's a more a philosophical and ethical discussion than it is a scientific discussion, but it's a really interesting discussion and a debate we need to have, because I think if you go to the population of Africa and tell them that we are starting to grow meat in labs when we are having a very effective livestock production in Europe already, then they would ask why. Because in countries where the human welfare is still a very big problem, there they are really struggling to understand why we are doing like we are doing in Europe. And personally, I think that this COVID crisis is going to change the debate a little bit, because food security have become an issue very, very suddenly. It's never happened. I can see that you and me are about the same age. So yeah, sorry, but I think it's going to be debated. And now I'll shut up. Sorry. I
think this is a very interesting discussion to listen to. And I think certainly, yeah, there's a lot of things to say about information and how people form their opinions and ethics. But we also have 2 questions from the audience, so I'd like to give the floor to them first. Let's first start with G.R. Nicolaus here at the Zoom call.
Hi, I'm Gaia. I have a question for Mr. Post. So I've been wondering about ethics, and you already started talking about it now. So I was wondering, since you have been studying, you have been on this study since already like a decade, which it's a very long time, it's a long project. Did you receive any kind of, you and your group and your project, did you receive any kind of criticism related to ethics? And I'm not referring specifically to groups of vegans or vegan associations or vegetarians, but maybe more about, didn't anyone ever tell you that you have been playing to like being God or going against nature, or, you know, challenging the rules of nature? Any kind of criticism related to this kind of ethics, or maybe also on the religious side, perhaps, if you ever...
Yeah, I did. Interestingly, the comment, you know, do you think you are playing God? Very, very little, and with very, very little depth. What is a kind of a more interesting question, I think, is, or a more interesting comment, is that this is unnatural, right? That's, I'm always tempted when I do this in a live session, I'm always tempted to ask those people, you know, look at the person next to you, and the person right to you and left from you. There's a 10% chance that that person is born out of in vitro fertilization. Are you going to tell that person that he or she is unnatural, right? So the fact is that natural, unnatural is not a very useful comment. In fact, the regulatory agencies in this world have no definition of natural and unnatural, and they have no regulation around it. You know, I try to translate what natural means to people, and I have a hard time because I have a very different concept of natural than most other people. I try to translate it, and I think it has a lot to do with safety. We tend to think that natural things are more safe to us than others, although, of course, the venom from a black mamba snake is also natural and not very safe. But we tend to kind of equate those things. And so I think once you have a kind of developed, or have people develop trust and understand that this is safe, the whole natural, unnatural discussion disappears. I mean, I assume you're from Spain, you have the Spanish flag on the back. You're not?
No, I'm actually Italian, but that's from the Erasmus.
Okay. But you know, what's a good Italian example? I don't know. Parma ham. Parma ham is a fermented ham. It's not a natural product, so to speak, unless you have to cure it very, very specifically to make it into that delicious product. It's not a natural product in and by itself. I don't hear any sound anymore. Is that me?
I am very sorry, I was still muted. Yeah, I thank Gaia for her question, and thank you also very much for the answer. I saw that Ms. Steenberg might have wanted to react to this.
Yes, I very interesting, and please, when all this COVID crisis thing is over, I would very much like to meet you in person, Professor Post, because that could be really interesting, and also to see your work. It's very interesting. I just wondered, when I read about lab-grown meat, I still see words like antibiotics and hormones used in the substrates. How far are you from not being having the need to use that for growing the meat now?
We don't use antibiotics or hormones. We just
don't use it at all. No. Okay, that's good to hear, because that's maybe one of the fake news that runs around lab meat. Like there's lots of fake news running around about livestock, and that's a really huge problem nowadays. But again, that's a new and philosophic discussion that we can take later, maybe.
Yeah, I think some of this will be validated by EFSA, right? So at some point you have to believe in something, and we are going to supply all the data to EFSA, and that's part of the reason why I kind of like that procedure, because it's kind of an independent validation of this process.
That's very good to hear. We have a question from the live stream from someone called Bianca, and I think it's more addressed to Professor Post, but yeah, it doesn't state clearly. Do you think that since people are easily adapting to new diets, a shift towards vegetarian diets would be more desirable?
I think so. I do agree with that. Not for me, I like meat, so it's but for other people, definitely. And I think it's going to happen. I think inevitably we are going to move towards a more vegetarian diet. And I don't know how fast that is going to happen, but the trend is there. It's definitely, as I mentioned, no longer seen as something weird. It's actually seen as something admirable. And that's kind of the first step towards wider acceptance of this. And in a strange way, I think actually these cultured meat products will facilitate that. Apparently the societies of vegetarians and vegans in Europe tend to agree with that, because they typically invite me to give lectures and they really like me for some reason. But the reason why I think this will facilitate a little bit, meat is not only a part of our diet, it's a culture. Right? It's a culture of a very long-standing culture, and meat is not just broccoli. It has all sorts of other connotations of power, of fire, of masculinity, of blood, of hunting, all those kind of ancient associations that come with it. And when you start making this in the lab, all those connotations disappear. So it becomes really more like broccoli than, even if tissue-wise and taste-wise it's exactly the same, culturally it's going to be different. And so I think in that way, it's, from a cultural perspective, it's kind of more like an intermediate between meat on the one hand, where you have to, excuse me for mentioning it, but you have to kill animals, and on the other side, vegetables, where you basically only have to kill vegetables.
All right, thank you very much. We have a question from Tanika, and afterwards we'll move on to Brandy again. She asked about the procedure for the lab-grown meat. In regards to animal welfare, is anesthesia used on the cows when doing the biopsy, even though
Yes.
it's only a minor procedure?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Of course, not only for the diminishing the discomfort for the animal, but also for the safety of the veterinarian who does the biopsy.
All right, thank you very much. Then we move on to Brandy.
So you're producing meat in the laboratory so you can test it out. What do you do with the meat and how much are you producing? Are you grilling it and baking it, and are people taking it home to eat for themselves? What do you do with the meat that you're producing?
Well, that's not allowed yet. We are not allowed to sell it yet because for that first EFSA has to approve it. And that's going to take at least another 1.5 years. So currently we are not allowed to sell it. And only under very specific conditions we're allowed to have people taste it. So as I mentioned, there's currently no product on the market yet. One of the interesting ideas about this, or the interesting things that happen around this, is that there is a lot more publicity and a lot more media attention than there is actual activity. So we are still very early in the beginning of this stage. We are producing like 100 grams a kilo, 5 kilo, but it's nowhere near. It's mostly for tasting and further improving and the regulatory approval, but not for the market yet.
Thank you very much. Our next question comes from Matthias.
So earlier it got mentioned about the ethics of like limiting other countries' development in agriculture, specifically in horticulture. So what I wanted to ask was related to that. Currently, as far as I'm aware, the Netherlands exports not only meat, but also large quantities of vegetables. I watched one news report which talked about how we export onions to Cameroon in Africa. And I also know from my family's background, because my grandfather worked with the Dutch government in their agriculture aid program, that the program essentially got slashed from 1998 ish until now, and that there has been no further development in redeveloping the agricultural economies in those countries, but just exporting to them. So I wonder what your opinion is on the ethics of that, beyond just meat.
I just the last 2 days I sat on a future forum for food, and this was one of the issues that we discussed: how perverse some of the mechanisms are in global food supply and agricultural chain. And I was the day before, I was in a meeting like this in South Africa, or virtually in South Africa, where a farmer actually complained that in Natal, local producers stopped producing their local produce because the market was flooded with cheaper products from the US and from Europe. And this obviously is appalling. But this is free market for you. It's unfortunately we have to kind of rely on regulations and much more strict policies to prevent this from happening, because otherwise it's just a free market that doesn't work. Is that what you were referring to or not?
Yeah, it is. Thank you. Is there any way we can regulate it, or like at least from a country perspective? So if we're talking about the Netherlands here, since I believe the Netherlands is the largest agriculture exporter in the world.
It's the
Could
second
the
largest.
Netherlands make any?
Yeah, this the second largest in agricultural value. Yeah.
Could the government make a concrete policy changes to adjust their, to address this issue?
Yeah, they could. They could forbid that if they. Of course, it's difficult for governments to do that, but in essence they could. They could just say, don't dump your stuff onto a Cameroon market because it's destroying the local economy there. Yeah, if they were altruistic, they could do that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. My apologies, my internet was gone for a couple seconds. Yeah, but thank you very much for the answer. Yeah, I think it's okay if Steenberg would like to raise one more question.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry, but I'm really curious about this, so it's really a good opportunity for me to have a person so knowledgeable to ask questions to. I would like to know how do you see the uptake of the market of your product in 10 years time in 2030, and what impact do you think it will have on the farming community in a region like Europe, and how would you then subsidize the people who gets out of the job because of the lab-grown meat?
Yeah, I get that question a lot, of course, very predictably. Let me tell you, you probably are aware of this, but well, the first one not because it's about my neighbor, but the other is so my neighbor was a pig farmer, pork farmer, and he had and also other kind of a mixed business. But he had a pork farm, and he could not make money anymore with pork. This was before the Asian flu. He could not make
African swine flu, yeah.
With the pork, so he switched to potatoes, and now he makes money again. So a farmer for me, this is just an example. A farmer for me is an entrepreneur who extracts value from land, and however they do that, doesn't really matter that much, whether it's by growing peas or by growing vegetables or by growing potatoes or by having pigs. Doesn't really matter.
I think a farmer in Switzerland would maybe challenge you a bit there, because it's not very easy to grow crops on the sides of the mountains.
A farmer in Switzerland is basically a summer activity to keep the pastures free from roughage so that they can ski on the winter.
Okay, then we say in the Pyrenees in Spain.
It's a heavily subsidized industry and not economical at all. And the Swiss actually acknowledge that. And so
okay, but then bad example. We take the Pyrenees in Spain instead.
I don't know anything about the Pyrenees in Spain.
No, but there are areas. Sorry, I'll finish very quickly. There are areas in Europe where it's not really easy or actually possible to grow crops, and where the farmers rely on their livestock production.
Yeah, okay. I've heard that argument before, but that doesn't really matter. So the one other thing that was interesting in the last half year, and everybody who has followed the news in the Netherlands knows this, because of the nitrous, we are kind of looking at the pig farm, the pork industry in the Netherlands, which is huge. Like in Denmark, it's huge in the Netherlands. And the government offered to buy out pig farmers. 40% of the pig farmers in the Netherlands have opted to be bought out.
You're probably right that that's the number, but maybe it's because that the demands that have been put on these farmers have been so high that it's not easy for them to produce anymore. And I understand in the Netherlands, it's a very heavily populated country and it's not very big. I understand the difficulties there, but seen on a European perspective, it's another story. And I know we're discussing in the context of the Netherlands, and I totally respect that. But it's different in the Netherlands if you compare with Romania, for instance, which is also an EU.
Yeah, but I think the same is happening in France, where the country is actually emptying. The countryside is emptying out, right? Agriculture farming is tough work. It's really tough work, and young people are not into this. If they have to choose between, shoving manure at freezing temperatures or sitting at a desk, they will sit at a desk. It's tough work, and I think that's the major reason why the countryside is kind of emptying out. In spite of all the subsidies, in spite of all the incentives, it's still hard work.
I agree with you. It's hard work, but it's also not recognized and appreciated that these people actually put food on our tables every day. And that's also one of the reasons that it might not be very attractive to work within the farming industry, because it's not sexy. And I see it as one of my tasks in my job to try to make food production and farming a much more attractive sector for young people to start in, because it is very important to get food on our tables. And all food cannot come out of the lab. I'm sorry, but I'm sure you're making great efforts, and I applaud you for that. But it's going to take quite a while before you can feed the population of Europe out of your lab.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We actually have a question from our live stream again that kind of relates to that, and it's addressed to both speakers. So I'd say we can take this one, and then we have another one that's also addressed to both of you to kind of conclude this debate. The question is, what do both speakers think about the impact of food waste when combating food security for the increasingly larger population? Maybe Ms. Steenberg, you'd like to start?
Yes, I would like to start. That's really something we need to be much more focusing on. And that's also one of the very big focus in the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork initiative from the European Commission. And definitely, especially here in the Western world, we need to focus a lot more on food waste. So we are really there. But I can say from a livestock perspective, if you look at when you slaughter a chicken, and I was a little puzzled when you said, "I'm sorry, I have to say that you kill an animal." Yes, you kill an animal to get meat. That's how it is. That's not something to be ashamed of. That's how you do it. I mean, a lion does not go and excuse when he have hunted down an antelope, right? So anyway, coming back to the subject, food waste is something we really need to look upon. And in the slaughterhouses, when we are slaughtering animals, everything is used. The blood, the feathers, the collagen, everything is used. So that's really a sector where food waste is not an issue. But in other parts of the chain, we of course need to look much more into it.
It's a really important issue. 40%, that's the estimation, 40% of all the food that's being produced is wasted for many different reasons, and for reasons that differ from location to location. It's a complex problem. You see now a lot of initiatives focusing on this, like foods that are a little bit weird of color or shape that are going to be used. Food distribution through shelters. It's all small scale, but there is at least attention to it, and there are technologies that will eventually reduce food waste to some degree, and it's a big part of the solution of the bigger puzzle.
Just sorry, I'm talking too much. Very shortly, just during here the COVID crisis, canteens have now when they're starting up again, people are coming back to work. They're not having buffets anymore for people to eat in the canteen. That is going to save a lot of food, I can tell you. Just one little thing.
All right, thank you for these two perspectives. And then our last question, I think, would be a good summary of what we've been discussing and what we've talked about today. Marianne asks on Facebook to both speakers, do you think that meat made in a laboratory will be considered a substitute or a supplement to natural meat in the future?
I think it will be a substitute. My PR people always ask me not to say this, but this is my, if, you have to ask yourself the question, if, 20 years from now, you walk into the supermarket and you see two pieces of meat. One is lab grown with lower greenhouse gas emission, no antibiotics, no animals killed, no, less land use, less water use. And you see, on the other hand, one that is from sort of the conventional meat. I think, at some point that we can no longer really justify to ourselves that we still eat conventional meat in that situation. Now that's assuming that quality is the same, taste is the same, price is the same. So all the other things are kind of equal, which is, something that you can discuss and maybe question. But if that's the case, then based on arguments that I have made before, mostly related to the ethical issues, but also to the environmental issues, I think we can no longer justify the existence of conventional meat. And that's not going to happen in 20 years, but it may happen in 30 or 35 years. Usually these things take a very, very long time.
And from my side, I'm sure it's not a surprise to you. I would say that it's going to be a supplement, because I think it's going to be ethically very difficult to defend that we are producing meat in a lab when we have the possibility of having it just next door. And again, there is a huge difference between the developed countries and the developing countries. I don't think that it's going to be affordable for a person in a developing country to buy lab meat in any time, even in your lifetime, all of you who are quite young. I'm not seeing that happening. And again, I have to ask, why should it be? We as humans have been eating animal protein for more than 2.5 million years. Why is it suddenly not defendable to eat animal protein anymore? To me, that's simply a puzzle I can't make. I think it's a really interesting debate, and I am very willing to take it with lots of people. I've been in debates like this several times, and I've used the analogy that what's the next step then? Is it that we all go down to the Serengeti and put up signs to tell the animals that they shouldn't hunt the game? We are designed as humans to eat meat anatomically, and I totally respect the people who choose to be vegetarians. I totally respect them and applaud them. That's very good. I also eat less meat than I did some years ago, but it's not something you need to defend that you're a meat eater. It's not something you need to defend that you think it's okay that animals are killed so you can eat meat. It's a natural thing.
All right, and I think with these remarks we can close tonight's debate. I think we've gained a lot of insights and facts from both perspectives, and I think that's very good for people to just take home and contemplate and see what your own perspective is on that. So yeah, please everyone give our two speakers a very warm, albeit virtual applause again.
Thanks a lot. And very interesting talk, Professor Post.
Same here. Yeah, thanks. Take care, and thanks for having me. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. And yeah, with this part, I think the intellectual